Thank you for joining today's session on Beyond Selenium, tackling Salesforce testing challenges with Provar. It's going to be an exciting session. Hopefully you learned something today. Hopefully you have some good takeaways for your team. And if not, then maybe you'll at the very least be entertained. So let me first introduce myself for those of you that don't know who I am. I always like to do this because we're all people. In the age of AI, it's easy to forget that we deal with humans. So I'm introducing myself. I am a real human. I'm not a bot. My name is Michael Dailey. I've been in the software testing, DevOps, coding space for going on about 9 years now. I have a background in software engineering, doing full stack with C#, C++, and I've also utilized Linux systems and Apache and MySQL PHP. So that's the LAMP stack there. That was in a very past life. So I've kind of done a lot of things around programming and developing over the years, but testing and DevOps are kind of my wheelhouse nowadays. I've been with Provar for about 6 years now, and my current role, which is shifting as we speak, but I am working on the product team, serving as product marketing and product management for one of our products here at Provar. I'm a Nashville native, and I live here with my wife and 2 sons. You'll see in the picture there, from left to right. That's my wife, April, and then the littlest there are our youngest, who's about 7 weeks old, Levi, and then Micah, who's 3 years old there. So I am a Lord of the Rings super fan. You'll see this map behind me. That is not the United States. That is Middle Earth. For those of you that are familiar, would have recognized that. And I'm also an avid gamer. So that's enough about myself. Hopefully you maybe can relate to any of that. But anyhow, let me get into the agenda today. So first of all, I'll cover what is Selenium. For those of you that don't know what Selenium is, I'll give a brief introduction, and then we'll do kind of a deep dive into the history and some things that you can learn about Selenium as it pertains to test automation in Salesforce. Then we'll talk about Provar, intro the main product, Provar automation, and talk a little bit about that. And then probably the most important bit here is setting up things in a Salesforce testing environment from Selenium versus Provar, showing some of the major differences, and then tackling this question that I really am anxious to get into, is talking through the silver bullet that a lot of people often talk about in the software development lifecycle, and is AI that silver bullet for test automation? So we'll talk about that. And then lastly, we'll get into the main issue in testing Salesforce. That's the DOM problem. And then, of course, maintenance and costs associated with test automation. So as always, we'll have a demo at the end. So stick around for that. And what's not listed here is Q&A as well. So post-demo, there will be a Q&A. First of all, what is Selenium? Selenium is first of all, it is an open source application. It was founded over 20 years ago now. So for those of you that didn't know that, it was actually founded by a man named Jason Huggins, who was working at a company called ThoughtWorks. And it was initially created to be an internal tool that they were using to test their web applications at this particular company. The name Selenium actually comes from a competing tool called Mercury that they were kind of taking a jab at the time. But it is an open source tool. And what that means from a software perspective is that it's free to use and the community contributes to it. They collaborate on it. All support is handled through community forums and repositories on GitHubs and things like that. The Selenium project now, of course, has a lot of different libraries that are available. There's their WebDriver. They have their own IDE. There's Selenium Grid for cross-browser testing. So there's a lot of things that are out there nowadays for Selenium because it's been around so long. It is kind of the test automation standard when it comes to generic web-based testing. And this question that you may have not thought that I would answer is why Selenium is great for testing, especially Salesforce. So, there's always pros and cons to everything. So I like to go over the pros first. One of the good things about Selenium is that it does support cross-browser automation. And this would be your Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. So this is pretty critical for a lot of Salesforce users who work in diverse industries. And, they want to cross-platform test across different browsers to make sure that everything's working on all of their applications. There's also the main thing about Selenium and the way that it behaves is that it's meant to emulate a real user interacting with your website through clicks, through typing, through selecting things, through dragging and drop. So, there are a lot of ways to emulate real user interactions with Selenium. So this is a plus in the Salesforce world. And of course, when you're dealing with Salesforce UIs like the Lightning experience that are very dynamic. It's very important to make sure that you're actually emulating what a real user would be doing in the UI. It is highly extensible. This is something that is probably one of the biggest pros for Selenium, is that it's so widely adopted across the ecosystem. It integrates with just about everything out there. It works with just about any testing framework that you can imagine: TestNG, JUnit, Maven, and of course, there's a lot of CI tools that it integrates with out of the box as well, because there's a lot of plugins that have been made available by the community and the support for Selenium across the ecosystem. So GitHub Actions, Jenkins, Azure DevOps, they all have built-in Selenium automation and reporting capabilities. And of course, there's reporting tools that are built into it. Of course, you can integrate with things like Jira, Allure, extent reports, and things like that. So it's really great for embedding Salesforce testing across your entire testing pipeline in a scalable sense, mainly just because of how well it integrates with all the things that are out there. So these are kind of the pluses for Selenium and what it's got going for it. It's very widely adopted and used across the ecosystem. So let me talk now about Provar before I get into the negatives of Selenium. Provar, for those of you that don't know, is a test automation, quality lifecycle management focused company. We have our flagship product, which is Provar Automation. Provar Automation helps you with low-code test authoring with pro-code flexibility. What we mean by that is we have a lot of powerful custom test steps that you can create in Provar for advanced functionality. So if you are a coder, if you do like Selenium because you get to code, we're not taking all of that away from you. We still give you the ability to do that in Provar and get into the code if you want to. But we do have that main authoring experience, which is our test builder, which I'll demonstrate later, which is entirely no code, right? It's all drag and drop, all flexible automation in that sense. We have what we are proudly been around for a long time. Provar has been around since 2014. And since then, we've been focused on testing Salesforce and being Salesforce centric in our approach. So with that being said, we do have a market leading integration with the Salesforce metadata. And this is what gives us the ability to create low maintenance test cases in your Salesforce orgs. We also offer nearly 100 different drag and drop commands that you can add through our test palette, which you see kind of pictured down there in the bottom right-hand corner. And I'll talk more about that in our demonstration later as well. And then the last bit here, and this is probably one of the most important when it comes to scaling out your testing and your test automation, is the reusability aspect of Provar and how you can define what we call callable test cases, and you can parameterize tests, orgs, personas, and profiles, and things like that. So it really helps you to scale out your testing because tests are org agnostic, they're profile agnostic. There's nothing that's static in terms of when you're creating your test cases in reference to Salesforce. So you have a lot of control there. And then the modularity aspect allows you to break down larger test cases into smaller flows that you can debug quite easily inside a test builder. So we give you a lot of control, we give you a lot of power with the platform, and we're very Salesforce centric. So these are kind of the main value adds for Provar if you're looking at it from a test automation perspective. So I want to bring up a quick poll, and hopefully that poll will be appearing on your screen shortly. So the question is, are you currently using Selenium or any other automation tool for your Salesforce or application? And the options are listed there. If your choice is other, if you wouldn't mind just leaving a note in the chat what the other is. Of course, this is optional, but would be interested to know. So I'll leave that poll up for a few moments as everyone's making their selections. Just want to get a kind of a head count of what we got here. And I'm not sure if I'm able to see the poll results live on my end, but I'll be interested to take a look at those after the fact, but just to kind of get an idea of where everyone's coming from. So as I said myself, my background coming from test automation, and I've used Selenium with C# in a past life. So I have used Selenium before, and I have used Provar. Oh, here are our results. They just popped up while I was talking. Okay. So we have majority of you, 64% say that they are actively using Selenium. Someone else is using another automation tool, and 18%, we have around 20% say that they're not using any automation tools yet. So we have a pretty good spread there with the majority coming from the Selenium background. So Great to see. Okay, so let's get into some more interesting discussions now. I want to talk through, and I'm going to show some of this, not a lot of it, because we don't have all day, because it would take me all day to set all this up, or even longer. So I can't do it in an hour. But if you were to go from beginning to end, if you were going to start the process and you say, okay, I'm starting from zero, how do I set up a Salesforce testing suite in Selenium? There's many ways you can go about this. So um, I'm going to talk through the method that I followed and maybe what many consider a very typical approach to this, and that's using Java and Selenium. There's a lot of programming languages that you can use with Selenium because it is cross-platform, it is cross-functional, it is cross-programming language. So there's Python, there's C Sharp, there's Java, there's JavaScript. There's a lot of different languages that have Selenium libraries. Java is one of the more common ones, so that's going to be kind of the one that I'll demonstrate. But this would be your first thing, is deciding what programming language you're going to use, install it. Then you need some kind of project tooling, some kind of packaging solution. This is Maven, Gradle. This is what you use for kind of your project on your IDE, which leads into the next few steps here, and that is we need to download and set up an IDE. We need to decide where we're actually going to do our development. IDE, for those of you that don't know, is an integrated development environment. It's basically a souped up version of a notepad, a text editor that has plugins, extensions, version control, system integration, things like that. And you also need to have your web drivers, of course. You need to be able to execute across whatever web drivers, whatever browsers that you want to support. So you got to download all of those. Then you need to add all your dependencies. Of course, this is going to be an iterative task. You don't know out of the gate what dependencies you might need. So you'll start with the defaults and then kind of go from there. You need to create your project in your IDE once you've decided on that and everything's done installing. Add your Chrome drivers, set up your project. You need to begin the process of, okay, now once I have everything set up, now I can create a base class for maybe logging into Salesforce, which is a task in itself. You need to figure out how your login is handled. You need to inspect the page for your login screen to find locators to actually log in and capture those in your code in your class for Salesforce login. Then you need to deal with different login flows. So whether you support SSO, OAuth, you may need to import some custom libraries to do that. I've actually created a utility function in my Selenium project that allows me to log in using OAuth, but that's not something that's supported out of the box. I had to make it work for my scenario, and there was some trial and error there. So a lot of what you'll find with Selenium is that's kind of the typical thing. There's libraries online, there's a lot of support, but nothing is cookie cutter. You got to take what you find and make it work for your scenario, which is kind of the running theme here. And then you need to start finding some locators for your flow. So you got to figure out, okay, what's my flow going to be once I have my login process? Maybe I'm creating a new account. Maybe I'm doing a convert lead flow. You got to find all the locators that you're going to need for that flow. There's different ways you can go about this. You can do this, back and forth, where you do some of it, build it out, go back to Selenium, see if it works, test it, debug it there, go back and find some new locators and keep building on it that way. So you can kind of do it in a building block approach, or you can try to do it in one shot and deal with the debugging nightmare that will likely ensue there. And then you'll probably want to create some reusable methods. You need to make sure that you have some common elements there that you interact with. You want to package those and make those available using, some smart object and class, factoring in terms of your actual programming. Then you need to string it all together, right? So we have to make sure we have our login, what user we're logging in as, what app we're going to, what scenario. All that's got to be, strung together in an actual test case that you can run, that you can execute. And then you got to start debugging the whole thing all together. So you got to start debugging it and seeing how it's going to work. And undoubtedly, your first debug run will result in a failure 9 times out of 10. It did for me as well, and I've done this before. So you're going to probably encounter some kind of failure, right? You're going to encounter some kind of failure along the way. And then you need to decide, okay, what do I do now? There's a lot of different ways that you could handle this failure. One such method is panicking, which is my preferred option if I don't know what to do. And then the next sprint begins. So now we've wasted about 2 weeks up until this point getting to where we are, and now our next sprint started. So we don't really have time to, so now we got to go back to step 12. Okay, so some of this was satire, obviously, but you get the idea. There's a lot involved if you want to set all this up. It's not something that you just install Salesforce testing for Selenium, right? There's a process that you have to follow. So now I'll talk about it from the Provar perspective. So first step is install Provar. Then we can create a connection to a Salesforce org using the user interface. No code up to this point. And then we just click the little test builder icon inside of Provar to launch test builder. And then we can start mapping our test steps immediately just by doing right click add to test case. And we can even go and we can parameterize those steps as we go. We can easily make the test case data driven by adding in a spreadsheet using our drag and drop commands. And then, the test just works. It works for all of our orgs. If we were using sandboxes, it works for all our different scenarios if we're doing different profiles and things like that. So much easier, right? There's a lot of things that we've done for you, and I'll get into this in the demo and talk through kind of the differences in a little bit more detail. But you can kind of see at a high level, there's a lot more involved if we're doing this from a coding perspective, and there's a lot of domain knowledge at play here. So you'll see a couple of these throughout my presentation today. I like to keep things lighthearted, but kind of following this trajectory, right? You may spend 10 plus working hours, a very long or perhaps 2 working days automating a single test case in Selenium, and you've got success. You feel confident. You start establishing a long list of libraries of locators that you're going to use for your application, and then undoubtedly Salesforce release breaks all your locators, which then, of course, breaks all of your tests. If anyone's ever been in this scenario before, you're all too familiar with this. Salesforce releases breaking locators in Selenium-based automation. So this is a very common theme, which leads into this thing that we refer to as these 3 kind of big pillars in regards to automated testing challenges, and that is complexity, reusability, and scalability. These are the 3 main things that you have to think about if you're exploring or if you're utilizing Selenium for Salesforce-centric automation. The complexity aspect is Salesforce is a very complex system. No one's using vanilla Salesforce. Everyone has a lot of configurations, a lot of customizations, a lot of custom business processes, approval processes, different things like that. The tests themselves are also not very reliable, as I just said, and it takes a long time to build them. Then the reusability aspect comes into play here. The code itself is not inherently reusable. You have to build that into it. You have to create functions. You have to pass things in using different parameters. You have to figure out return values, how you're going to make things abstracted away, how you're going to utilize classes and different functions within those, sharing and different things like that. And then there's limited reusability at that point, because usually what you've done is very, very specific for one test case. So then you have to go and think about, okay, how do I get this to work for all my personas? How do I get it to work for all of my different orgs, my environments? What about multi-factor authentication? What about all the different login flows? So there's not a lot of reusability often in what you do. You do something and your code base just grows and grows and grows. And so that leads into the scalability side of things. Whenever you're creating things, in my initial walkthrough, when I was talking through that 20-step process for setting up Selenium for Salesforce, that's just, for one user. Every user is going to have to go through that process of setting it up on their machine because they're developing it locally. So scaling this out across your team is, a challenge in itself, but also scaling the testing itself for an individual user can be quite daunting, because creating a single test case is undergoing, an active development process. It's not just going and following a process in a tool or using a user interface or something like that. And the tests themselves don't scale very well because you spend a lot of time fixing the test cases rather than actually creating new test coverage, creating new test cases in Selenium. This is one of the biggest challenges that we see, which leads directly into what we, fondly refer to as the rework spiral. So the rework spiral is this little image here that you see. It's a nice little diagram that illustrates it. But basically, you have this process of you create a test case, you automated a workflow in Salesforce with Selenium, and then Salesforce breaks that workflow, those locators. You go and rework it, right? And then, the cycle kind of continues. So really what this leads to is you're actually testing and you're spending more time fixing tests than actually building out new tests and building out new customizations and configurations for your app. So rather than getting more test coverage over time, you're really just adding more maintenance and technical debt to your testing process, which is never what you want to see. So the tests themselves become more fragile than your actual org and your flows and your customizations. And so one of the biggest returns on investment that you see if you utilize a test automation tool like Provar is this reduction in test maintenance. So it may not be in the initial front end. Maybe you're very proficient in writing test cases and chugging out automation for Salesforce and Selenium. That's not the actual problem. More so, the problem is the actual maintenance and maintaining all those locators. And of course, there's things out there that can help us, which I'll talk more about when I get into the AI discussion. But that's the biggest challenge that we see. So the way I see it, you have two options. You can use Provar, or you can, lose Uno. So the choice is yours. That being said, I'll talk more into kind of the major differences, right? So we got into the Salesforce test suite setup in Selenium and Provar. Now I'm going to talk through a brief kind of overview of just a list of comparisons that we can draw between the two solutions. So first and foremost, of course, Selenium is 100% code-based. There's not an interface for it. There's no low-code option. It's developer-friendly, but that's all, right? It is a developer tool. And this is perhaps a pro. We talked about this before. It is open source, so it is technically free, but there's no direct support available. So if you do run into an issue, good luck. You have to solve it, you alongside with your AI co-pilot or your friend who's very good at programming. And that being said, as I said, it's a developer tool. And as we all know, developers and automation engineers are come with quite a price tag associated with them, especially in the context of Salesforce. A lot of domain knowledge there, so it can be quite costly. And for those of you that are coming from a Selenium background, this is something that I actually encountered and I discovered when I joined Provar 6 years ago. When I was doing Selenium automation, we were only doing web-based testing, right? We were only actually testing the web interface for an Oracle application at the time. And all of our back-end testing, all of our other testing was done using unit testing, right? We had unit tests for APIs, database actions, and things like that. But it wasn't ever strung together with our web testing. They were entirely separate processes, different teams even. So one team was responsible for testing the backend, the interfaces, the services, the APIs, and the other team was responsible for the interfaces. So this is something that it can be a problem in the context of Salesforce because those two are so tightly integrated. Oftentimes, having one focus on UI testing can be a big drawback there. So Selenium, of course, that's a major limitation that we have. And the locators, of course, these are going to be locators that you discover, that you create. They're all hard-coded. They're all based on XPath, CSS locators, JavaScript locators. And if none of that makes any sense to you, then that's kind of the technical challenge that we have here. So that being said, there's also no built-in support for Salesforce testing, which I talked about, no login methods, nothing like that. Debugging itself is a painful process because you're coding something, you're running it in debug mode, maybe setting some breakpoints, maybe inspecting the page as you go, but you can't edit code and run the code at the same time. So you have to go back and forth and see what's actually happening when you run into a failure and things like that. And of course, that leads into kind of the maintenance nightmares that typically ensue. There's a lot of technical debt that you end up mounting up with Selenium because you're not only creating code for your Salesforce org, but now you're creating code to test the code that you've created for your Salesforce org. So you can see how the debt just builds there. And not only that, the authoring process can take a long time. Even with accelerators, even with co-pilots, there's not a silver bullet to this. And I'll talk more about this a little bit more in the following slides. So on the Provar, on the adverse side here, Provar, of course, as I talked about, it's no low code, pro code flexibility, and we do have built-in support. You run into an issue, you can't test a flow, you need an integration, you need guidance, you need help with a particular process, setting it up. We're there to help you 24/5. So you have that available at your fingertips. Not only that, anyone can use the tool. So it's not built for developers. It's not built for QAs specifically, although QAs tend to be more proficient out of the gate than, say, maybe an admin or BA. but it is built for anyone who wants to test Salesforce. That's kind of plain and simple the initial goal there. And of course, we have that full end-to-end support. So rather than focusing just on testing the UI, we're testing full end-to-end business processes. And we have a combination of recognizing things on the page. So rather than just using pure locators, we have what are called metadata-based locators, which are adaptive. They have built-in self-healing into them. We have our 2 proprietary locator technologies that enable us to interact with LWCs and component-based frameworks, such as Experience Cloud and things like that. So there's a lot of built-in technology to the tool that gives you the flexibility to test whatever you want. And of course, Provar was literally created for Salesforce. Selenium was generic web-based. Provar was created to test Salesforce. So, plain and simple there. And we do have an interactive debugger. So you can actually create a test case and debug it as you go. And you get intelligent refactoring as you go as well, where you can refresh locators for a page. You can make easy updates. You can jump around in the test case. You can edit things in live time and all of that. And of course, all of that gives you the flexibility and the ability to scale out your testing quite frequently. And then the last 2 points here, because we are aligned with the Salesforce release roadmap, this is kind of one of the big things with Provar is that we have releases that coincide with each Salesforce release. So what that means is your tests don't break. Salesforce release comes along, your tests still function, behave the same as they did before. And then the test builder application, which I'll be demonstrating when I get to the demo part, is what allows you to author test cases very quickly without having any coding experience or anything like that. Okay, so now on to the other side of this topic, this conversation of the AI. So a lot of you may have used AI tools before. I'll actually be throwing up a poll in the next slide to gauge that, but previously, Selenium, maybe one of those things that required a lot of hours, a lot of setup time, a lot of time to develop and write the code and think intelligently about what you're writing and look up methods and go to documentation. You don't really have to do a lot of that anymore because we have all these tools available to us. We have ChatGPT, we have GitHub Copilot, Cursor, if you're into vibe coding, which is the newest thing I'm told. And, a lot of these things are trivializing code creation itself. But the problem is the actual quality or the output of the code that's being generated, right? So on the right-hand side of my screen here, this is kind of a meme that illustrates my point. This is actually from a Reddit thread, but if any of you have ever used ChatGPT, you've probably been through a similar scenario where you go through iterations of, okay, hey, I have a problem. Oh, here's your fix. It still didn't work. Oh, okay, here's the fix. Okay, here's the actual fix. Okay, here's the final fix. And then you get to it and, it never actually finds a solution in that scenario. And you're banging your head and you're spending probably more time going back and forth with ChatGPT than if you just did it yourself. So that being said, it's definitely not the silver bullet to testing, right? There's still these challenges that we have to solve. There's got to be a human element, a human in the loop, as we refer to. But then there's a lot of things that we talk about the quality of what's actually being generated. Is it something that's going to be scalable? Or what locators is it giving me if I ask ChatGPT to create a Selenium test case for automating a workflow? It has no knowledge of your application. It has no context of your org. It has no context of your profiles, your users, your integrations. There's no way to give it all of that information at once, right? At least in a seamless process. So how can I let it know, what I need? So a lot of this is going to be manual effort on my part to be able to write that code. And then the actual maintenance of the code is another thing. If you don't really instill best practices into your actual whatever chat you're using, whatever AI tool you're using, as you go and refactor things as you go, the maintenance is definitely going to be at play here because it tends to generate quite large snippets for code sometimes that we don't need. So that's something that to keep in mind as well. And as I said, the time that you actually spend debugging the code that they give you, you're inheriting something that's written by, someone else essentially. So understanding that code is one thing, but then if you need to maintain it at a later date, is that something that you could actually do? So then there's the cost of owning the thing. There's the cost of actually dealing with the ownership of the code itself. And then, what about the droid attack on the Wookiees? Anybody? No. Salesforce. That's a Star Wars reference. Sorry. Anyway, Poll number 2. So you're currently using or planning to use AI tools like GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT to assist with coding or testing activities. Just curious here. I have my assumptions of what the answers might be, but I wanted to get a poll here to see where we are. And those results are appearing now to me. Okay, so looks like we had about 57% say that they're not using it for work-related code or testing, but planning to explore AI tools soon. And only about 21% say that they're actively using it for work-related coding or testing, with an equal percentage saying that there's no plans to use it at all, which is interesting. So I did expect more to be in the yes category, saying that they're using it actively. So maybe something to consider for your development team. But anyway, I'll go ahead and close that and we'll move on. I think this is my last meme. No promises, but just had to throw this in here because I just had to deal with this the other day. And, sometimes you go through this phase, right? So I'm just hammering home the point. AI is not the silver bullet to anything right now, right? There's a lot of challenges that it can help us solve. There's a lot of problems out there that can be solved with AI, but it's definitely not test automation right out the gate. There's a lot of things that we have to figure out and intelligently work through because it can't give us a solution. And there's another side of this too, right? So maybe it's able to create something very basic for you, and it even gives you the right locators, and it even creates like utility functions and make sure everything's best practices and all of that. Assuming all of that, what if you want to then go ahead and add additional fields? What if you want to update all of your locators? What if Salesforce breaks your locators, right? How would you handle that if you're using AI to do it? There's not really a simple way to do that. How do you add test data? How would you integrate that into your test cleanup processes that you have in your testing sandboxes? How would you handle logging into other orgs and handling parameterizing your login process so you can allow for additional users? How do you interact with APIs? How do you incorporate API and UI testing into the same flow? And, very topical here, how would you build in actual Agentforce testing? How would you go about the process of creating a Selenium test case to automate an Agentforce conversation? This is something that would be incredibly interesting to go through. If anyone has done this, please let me know successfully, because you get a dynamic response back from an agent, so it's difficult, right? It's a challenging process. How do you utilize data sources? How do you test scratch orgs? These are all things you have to think about. And then lastly, how do you add additional testing for longer scenarios? So the scaling aspect of it. So if you're using AI to build out all your test suite and you're able to do that really easily, and you're like, Michael, it's easy. You just use AI. These are all the things that you need to think about if you're using AI in that context, and something that I would caution towards in the Selenium perspective. So that being said, there's one last bit that you have to be aware of, and that's the DOM problem. So the DOM problem, and no, I'm not talking about this DOM. I'm talking about a different DOM. I'm actually talking about this one here. So the DOM problem is, for those of you that don't know what DOM is, it's a document object model. And basically what it is, it's the data representation of objects and kind of how they're structured in a web application or a web document. So you can kind of think of it that way. It's like the architecture behind the scenes. So this problem, the DOM problem, began quite a long time ago, well over 6 years now. But it really began kind of speeding up when Lightning Web Components started becoming more prominent in 2019, 2018, 2020. So you had this statement here from Salesforce, and you can go to this link and you can read about it more if you're interested in it. But basically, this is the statement that Salesforce put out saying that not only is the DOM not reliable, it's we're saying that it's actually very unreliable in this sense. And if you're using WebDriver based automation, which Selenium WebDriver in this case, your tests are going to require ongoing maintenance. So they kind of just warn you against this. If you're using Selenium, consider this a warning from Salesforce themselves. Your tests are going to have a lot of maintenance in them. And that's just kind of there, right? So that's from Salesforce themselves. This is something that you have to think about. Okay, and obviously I say all this that this was 6 years ago. This problem hasn't gotten any better. This problem has gotten much, much worse. So just keep that in mind. So I want to present a couple of case studies very quickly, just to talk through a couple of different users that we have of Provar that reported differences between Selenium, coming from a Selenium background and then switching over to Provar, some of the things that they noticed. So right away, the biggest change is, of course, that productivity gain in the maintenance, right? The maintenance reduction by 88% really helped to alleviate the burden for this particular team. This was a Salesforce testing team, the business technology team, and they were actually using Provar to test for an org, their V2 mom instance, which had over 80,000 users in it. And in this scenario, they had quite a lot of Selenium test cases that they needed to execute. And, you're talking about something that took over 3 months to accomplish down to just 1 week with Provar. So really realizing some huge productivity gains just by adopting an automation solution that was built to test Salesforce. So that's one side of it. The unspoken benefit here is that the development team was actually able and encouraged and emboldened to then go and create more stuff. The admins, the developers, like, oh, okay, we can include these items in this sprint now because we know the testing team can support it. They have greater bandwidth now because they're utilizing best practices, they're utilizing Provar for test automation. So that gives us more ability to add stuff into our release process. So we can not only release faster, but we can release more at a higher bandwidth. So really accelerated their deployment, their release processes, 12 times faster to automate. So that gave them that benefit right out of the gate. So that was one story. Another one here, and this is quite significant as well. This was one of our insurance companies that we work with, but a very common thing in the Salesforce world is profile and permission-based testing. So we actually have a specific offering, a specific feature set inside of Provar to do profile and permission-based testing very easily. So you can do it with one test case, you can simplify it, and you can do it very quickly because it's utilizing a lot of behind the scenes, APIs and SOQL and things like that. So rather than doing it with Selenium, where you're logging in as each, persona and you're going through every object, every page and validating field level access, read only, different things like that. That's a lot of hours for execution. So you can see here, that's, the very dramatic decrease in time to execute when you're going from over 2,000 hours to run all these test cases through Selenium to just under a couple of days. So it's still very long process because there's a lot that they're testing. But if you look at that, that's quite significant. That gives you a lot of ability and confidence to be able to do this and scale it out more reliably. Because obviously, once you're at that point with your Selenium tests and you have over 2,000, 2,600 of them, I can't imagine the maintenance that they were going through on a weekly, a monthly, on a release-based cadence to keep all those test cases up to date if there's even one small change, right? So that's going to be quite a large process in maintaining all of that. So you can see here the actual time to build all of this also is a big factor. Creating all those test cases in Selenium took over 13,000 hours, which I'm not even going to do the math, but it's a very long time. And you're going down to 3 hours to build the entire thing with approximately 1 minute on average per test, which is again insane when you think about the scale of that. So I just want to throw those out there: scalability and speed, but also maintenance. Those are kind of the big things that we're looking at if we're coming from the Selenium. Okay, so with the time that I have left, I'm going to run through a quick demo and I'll do Q&A at the end. So let me go ahead and switch gears now. Hopefully I still have everyone's attention. I haven't lulled anybody to sleep. Let me, I'm going to boot up my VS Code so you can take a look at my Selenium project that I have here. So this Selenium project that I've created is something that I didn't do overnight. It actually took me a couple of days of iterating on this. There was a lot of back and forth between GitHub Copilot, ChatGPT, and I even tried Agentforce for developers. Not a lot of success there because this isn't necessarily a Apex development or anything like that. Anyhow, I created this library. I have only a couple of tests that I'm doing. I created a couple of utility functions, some things to make my life easier. There's logging, there's reporting. I have this integrated with GitHub. So if I check in test cases, it runs them in a GitHub Actions and it'll actually report the results, and I can take a look at those here as well. So there's a lot of things that I've done in this project. I haven't just done, the basic login. So it did take me a couple of days to build all this out with the help of AI, of course. But I want to kind of show you some of this, not all of it in the interest of time. But for those of you that aren't programmers, I apologize. I'm showing code on the screen. I know that's a cardinal sin. But you can look at my account page here, and I'm only filling in, I think it is maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fields for the account page. So this account page here has 7 fields mapped, along with the delete button, the accounts tab itself, the new button, and different things like that. So all of these locators that I've built in for this account page, all these are pretty standard, pretty easy locators. There's nothing really too complex here. The problem with some of them, however, if you look at things like, for example, the customer priority dropdown, we're using a lot of these labels. So with Selenium, usually when you're using locators, you're using some kind of text, some kind of structure of the page to identify where those elements are. And 9 times out of 10, it's text, because that ends up being the unique way, the reliable way to recognize things on the screen. The problem with that is if they're not good locators, or if they're not uniques, then you can run into issues. Or if they're related to a specific text, like for this customer priority one here, if I were to change a label of a field in Salesforce, I would have to go and I would have to refactor my page here to use the correct label. So that's only a single field, and that's only a single test case. Now, multiply that to the nth degree, right? So you get the idea. But in this test case, I've done a lot of things, behind the scenes. I've created like a base class to handle all of my authentication, my logging in. Like I said, I had reporting built into this. I did at one point have some kind of SOQL interaction. I scrapped that because it ended up not working for my use case. So I'm doing everything in the UI. There's no API component to this. I am able to parameterize some of it, and I can add additional parameters, like all of my fields that I'm filling in here. For example, this is all hard coded, but I could easily make these parameters. Wouldn't be too difficult. So you can see some of this is scalable in the sense that I can parameterize it. I can port it to different languages if I want, different things like that. But again, I've only created really one useful test here. And if I were to run this, let me go ahead and run it, and hopefully it works. But basically, this test will do a couple of things. The first one is doing a create and verify account. So basically, I've automated my login, which of course involved me, mapping all of these fields, making sure I had good locators for them, figuring out how to actually handle that login process reliably if there was delays. I have to automate the app launcher to make sure I'm in the correct app. And then it goes through here, creates the account, and then it deletes the account. So it actually does it pretty quickly. It's pretty performant, because it's just running from my machine directly. So it is based on your, specs of your machine. But Selenium is not known for being slow necessarily, but it's just entirely restricted to the UI, to the DOM. So the time to actually create this test suite, the time to run it is relatively short, but the time to maintain it is where I'm going to run into issues. Okay, so yeah, and I think it's at this point, I don't know what happened to it. It was running good, but I think something happened and now it's bugged out. Usually it only runs for about a minute. So I think I'm going to go ahead and just kill it now. I've shown enough Selenium, so I'll go ahead and just exit out of this one. And because I'm running in Selenium, I have to deal with Selenium problems, which involves me going and killing my Chrome drivers behind the scenes to make sure I don't have running processes. So I've done that now. Okay, so that was Selenium. There's other things that are involved there, which I can show you. So basically, if I want to debug something, there's another thing that you have to do from the Selenium perspective. So let me show you kind of what my process is. So if I were to add a new field to my create new account page, I could either follow the locator that I already had for some of these and just change the label and hope that it works. Or what I could do is I could, right click on a particular field, say the account number, and go to inspect. And then you're doing this effort of trying to figure out, okay, what is a good locator to use for that particular field? So if I go to account number, here it is right here. So we know it's an input field. We can see it has a name here. So we could perhaps pull out a locator from there. So I could try using input, and I could say name equals account number. If I can type this correctly. And that doesn't always work. So let me check it again. There's no space there. So that was my issue. Okay, so there we go. So that actually is a locator. It recognizes that field. So then I can go and I could copy that and I could go back to my code base, add a locator for it, add a field for it, and then add the ability to interact with it using my function. So all that's well and good. That's adding a single field. But you can see here, what if all this were to change? What if locators were to break? What if all my tests were to fail because there was a Salesforce release? And think about scaling this out, right? This is not, I have knowledge of how to build out locators in Selenium, so I'm pretty adept at being able to figure that out and point out which locator to use for which element. But it's not always that cut and dry, right? There's not always good locators that are readily available, especially if you have a lot of customizations. So that's kind of your Salesforce process for testing if you're doing it in Selenium. Now let me show you in Provar. So I have Provar open over here. So Provar, again, test automation platform, Salesforce-centric, built to test everything. But of course, we are focused on testing Salesforce and everything around it. We have various connections that you can set up. And again, there's a UI behind this. So if I'm logging into Salesforce, rather than writing the code for it, figuring out locators for the login screen, I have a connection type here of Salesforce connection, and I can use any of the login methods that are already available inside of Provar. I can even add single sign-on very easily. So here's a connection that I've created using OAuth, and username and password is just as well, just as easy there. I can define different environments, out of the box, and I can define what we call an environment override. So if I have multiple sandboxes, I can very easily create environments for dev, QA, etc. I'll just add an override for dev here, change that to dev, change that to my sandbox, and save it. And now I have an override that I can use. This connection can now be parameterized, and I can change my test environment here in Provar from dev to production, etc. And it will override my connection. So a lot of things that we take care of for you out of the box using our framework. Now, once I have a connection, the next thing that I'll do is jump into creating a new test case. So I'm going to immediately, as I said, as I promised in my presentation, create a Salesforce org connection, and then immediately jump in launching Test Builder. So that's where I am now. So when I launch Test Builder, I can give my test case a name. So we'll just say create and verify account, basically just creating the same test that I had in Selenium. And then I can select which application I want to go to. So rather than having to automate the app launcher, I don't have to do that. This app list pulls from my user that I've created here, and it shows me all the apps that I have access to. So I can go to the Sales Lightning app and click finish. Now what this will do, this will launch my test builder, which will take care of launching Chrome for me, logging me into my Salesforce org using that admin profile, and it will also take me to the Sales Lightning app. So all these things are taken care of for you out of the box. I don't have to worry about Chrome drivers. I don't have to worry about importing custom libraries. None of that comes into play here. And then once we get to this point, we're actually able to start and we're ready to start creating our test case. So typically what you would do inside of Provar, when you're automating a new flow, you have your flow mapped out, right? What do you want to do? So for this one, I'm creating a new account. So I'll just go to the new account page here and I'll right click on account name, click add to test case. Now this captures the field from the Salesforce metadata. So right away, this is the biggest difference. Rather than going in and inspecting this element and finding how to locate it using XPath, CSS, JavaScript, etc., Provar takes care of locating elements for you out of the box. Even if there's not metadata for that element, we provide you a locator if you're not familiar with how to do that. And we can also utilize AI in the platform to automate a single step for all of these fields here on the page. So I can select which fields I want to populate, and I'll just do kind of the same ones that I had for my Selenium test case. And there was one for priority somewhere, which I'm not seeing right now. There it is right there. Right. And I can click add all. And what that will do is that will add all those steps to my test case inside a test builder. And it will actually allow me to run those test steps in real time. So again, when I said this is interactive, this is the big value add. We're not going back and forth and writing code. debugging, inspecting the DOM, trying to figure out which locators to use, etc. Another thing that's taken care of for you in our Salesforce integration is this navigation aspect. So you notice I didn't add a step here to actually go to the account tab or to open up the new account screen. Because I started mapping my steps from the new account screen, Provar intelligently knew that I need to navigate here before it started performing these steps. So I can just click resume here on my test builder, and that will allow me to just see these steps execute in live time. So I get all of that there. All the fields will be populated, and I can see the steps running. I get that nice little green check mark. And of course, running this in Test Builder, obviously it's slower than Selenium if I'm running it in this mode, but we have a headless option, we have a debug option, and a run option that allow you to run this behind the scenes. So that'll be just as fast as Selenium in that case. Then I can go ahead and I can right click and add my save button here, and I can click add and do. And now I have my create account test. The only thing that's missing is the delete step. So rather than mapping the delete here, I can actually, inside of Provar, I can parameterize my connection here. So this is the test case that I was just creating. And I can go and look at it inside of automation. And I can see all the steps here in plain English. I can go to my Salesforce Connect step. And I can go into the settings here and auto cleanup. And that will take care of deleting this account for me automatically. So I don't need to map the delete or figure out how to clean up after my test is done. So there you go. So that's creating a new account. It's doing the same thing that I was doing in Selenium. All of that framework that you saw, all those, locators that were hard coded out, all of that is built in automatically into here in Provar. I create my org connection, I launch Test Builder, and then I use AI to populate all the steps. So I've done the same thing in a matter of minutes that it took me several hours, if not a couple of days, to do in Selenium. So hopefully you kind of get the idea there. There's much more that I could show behind the scenes. I've taken a lot of time today, so I do want to go ahead and jump into our Q&A now. So let me switch back over to my slides here, and we will open it up to questions. So let me take a look at our Q&A and see if we've got some questions so far. There's a question here. Do you guys have a sandbox or something to test against through automation, i.e. Salesforce Instance Sandbox? If you're talking about internally, we have a regression pack that we actually run against the Salesforce pre-releases. So we've had access to those for a long time. So we run all of our regression pack against those. We have knowledge of all the Salesforce changes ahead of time. That allows us to make any updates to our product to ensure that your test cases don't break. So if that's what you're asking, then the answer is yes. We had another question here. Is Provar UI like Ranorex? How about the libraries to include our test automation code? So for my demonstration, hopefully that answered your question. Provar is a tool, is a platform, a solution that you install locally on your machine. You can import Java code directly into Provar. You can write Java code directly into Provar if you wish, but you don't have to. It's all low, no code, but we do have that pro code flexibility. There's a question here. I lost the very first part of the webinar, but is Provar free for use? Is there a fee for paying to use it? Yeah, so it is a paid product. So in that sense, it is different than Selenium, which is free. But a lot of what you adopt with Selenium is the cost of ownership. So it may be free to use, but it's not free to write code and maintain that code over time. So that's kind of the big difference there. How about the reusability of test cases across test suites or projects? Yeah, so a lot of reusability in Provar. Of course, that test case that I just created there, I could change the connection and run it in a different org. It's all parameterized. I could change the user that I'm running it as. I could even make it callable and throw it into a longer scenario. So that gives you that modularity. There's a lot of ways that we can do that. And you can share the test cases across different projects as well with other users. There's a question here about licensing. Provar is a user-based license. Yes, so it is based on the number of users that you want to be using the tool. How is it different than from Selenium IDE? Selenium IDE has a capability of test recording using a Chrome extension. Yeah, the major difference is, of course, there's not an out-of-the-box framework that we provide for all of your connections, all of your test management, your reporting, your ability to actually not use locators, right? Test recorders, kind of the main fallback in them is that they work, right, for the first run, but that's not really the problem. The problem is you need a test case that you can run time and time again. So the locators that it's giving you may work initially, but they probably have about 20 nested div tags. So as soon as anybody changes anything, those tests break. So that's my feedback on those. Is there any API to automatically convert existing Selenium test cases into Provar test cases? Not one-to-one. We do have some capabilities, consulting services where we can help with some of that. But we, generally speaking, we suggest that you recreate Provar test cases because, again, it's not a one-to-one relationship, as you saw in one of my case studies that I shared. This one here, for example. So converting that over wouldn't make any sense. It's a different way to do it. So a lot of times we have functions that are available that help do things in Selenium that could be, heavily reduced in terms of your number of tests. So can we use it in Spanish? Interesting. So the automation app itself is English. We do support internationalization from a Salesforce perspective. So if you're testing a Spanish user or you're testing in Spanish, we can build out a test case in Spanish inside a test builder, of course. We can support that. And we can run it in different languages as well. So all the languages that Salesforce support, we also support from an authoring and execution standpoint. Good question. Can Provar include for CI/CD with TeamCity, Octopus, or Azure for execution on Browser Stack? Yes, we actually have a Browser Stack connection natively in the product. So you can set up a connection directly to Browser Stack. And we have a CLI that you can use to run Provar programmatically from any pipeline, from any engine. So TeamCity, Octopus, any of those are valid options. Does Provar allow us to integrate with third-party tools by using REST API? I'd have to get a little bit more information about your question. We can test APIs. We can create connections to REST APIs within Provar. Hopefully you saw that in the connections screen at the beginning of my demo. Otherwise, we can integrate using our CLI, like I mentioned, so you can invoke Provar directly from the command line. Where can I learn Provar from scratch? From a practical perspective, is there a free trial or something? We do offer trials. The best way to connect with us is going through our sales team, I would say. Otherwise, you can go to provar.me. If you go to provar.me, you can create a free account for University of Provar where we have tons of certifications. You can learn all there is to know about Provar there for free. That's free to use forever, so you can use that however you like. But if you actually want to get your hands on the product, you do need to go through our channels to do that. How easy is it to jump on code in case to make some minor changes directly? C#. I'm not saying is your question if you can do it in C#? So the first part of the question, if you want to make changes to your Provar test cases, you don't need to use code. You don't need to write any code, and you should never have to write code. However, if you want to write code, if you're just really missing it and you love that aspect of your job, then you can. Locators behind the scenes in Provar are generated for non-Salesforce metadata supported fields. So if you're testing like an external web application, then of course we're using locators for that application. So you can edit those locators in the product behind the scenes. It's all Java based. You can write your own methods if you want to add custom functionality, but it's all in Java. So if you want to utilize C# or another language, you'd either need to port that over to Java or you need to execute the file using a Java command or something like that. Last question here we have is the locator self-healing works in Provar? If yes, then how? The answer that I'll give you is yes, it is. For the test case that I created, all those locators are self-healing because they're metadata based. They're dynamic in the sense that the locators for those particular test steps are not set in stone. So if the label for any of those fields changes, then the test case doesn't have to be updated. All you have to do is refresh the metadata in your project, which only takes a couple of seconds, and then you can rerun it, and then it'll run successfully. And the second part of your question, how? Automagically. So, okay. I think I got through all the questions there. Thank you all so much. Great engagement. Everyone stay with me for the full hour. So that was great. Thank you all so much for attending today's session. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully It was informative, educational, and entertaining. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.